last week we learnt about consequentialism. This was the last of the 4 theories. So if you remember, the first 2 weeks we looked at ideas and conceptions that were fundamental to thinking about ethics. So we looked at things like free will and contractualism and things like that. And then after 2 weeks of that, we started looking at 4 different ethical theories. And the last one we looked at was consequentialism. And in particular, we looked at a particular type of consequentialism. I'm sure you can tell me which one it was. Utilitarianism, yes, there's a bit of a clue on the board here. Okay, so we learned about consequentialism. So, okay, what's the hallmark of a consequentialist ethical theory? No.
It's the outcomes.
It's the outcomes or the
results.
Consequences, that's right. It's the consequences of an action in terms of which we evaluate it morally. And there are different sorts of consequentialism. We looked at utilitarianism, but can anyone name another sort of consequentialism?
You said libertarianism, but I'm not sure what that is.
Okay, so libertarianism looks at the consequences of an action in terms of freedom instead of in terms of happiness. That's libertarianism. So, for example, Rawls is arguably a libertarian because his first principle of justice is that each should have as much liberty as possible, consistent with equal liberty for all. So you're looking at actions in terms of the outcome for liberty rather than for happiness. But we've been looking at utilitarianism, and that looks at the consequences of actions in terms of what? Happiness, but it's not just happiness, is it? It's the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Absolutely. It's not my happiness. I mean, if it were, I'd be looking at actions according to whether the consequences were good for me or not. That's not a very ethical theory, is it? But utilitarianism is looking at the consequences of actions for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Good, okay. We asked whether there are any counterexamples to utilitarianism. And in order to quickly look at this, if you've got a claim that says acts are right if and only if, this IFF is if and only if, acts, the same acts, produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number, a counterexample will be an act that's right, but that doesn't produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or an act that's not right, and that does produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Do you see what I mean by a counterexample? And we looked at a particular one. Can anyone remember what it was?
Hiroshima.
No, we didn't look at Hiroshima. We looked at a particular situation as a potential counterexample to utilitarianism. It's the sheriff, exactly so. Can you tell me which of those that is? Is that an act that's right, but that doesn't produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number? Or an act that's not right, but that it's the last one? That's right. So the idea is that if the sheriff hangs the innocent tramp, that's an action that intuitively we want to say is not right. So it's not right, we're negating that one, but that does produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, if that action really is of that kind, then it's a counterexample to utilitarianism. And any action you can find that's either right and doesn't produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or wrong and does produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number, is going to be a counterexample to the utilitarian claim. Do you see why? Good. Okay. We also looked at the many different interpretations of utilitarianism. So if you remember, I told you it was multiply ambiguous. Can anyone tell me anything about any of these ambiguities of the greatest happiness principle, the claim that the right action is the action that produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number? Why is that ambiguous?
Because it might mean happiness now or average happiness over a period of time.
It might mean total happiness or average happiness, that's right. And there's a big difference between if I can create the average happiness of the people in this room, or if I'm not concerned about the average, but I'm looking only at totals, and John here is someone I can make very happy and very easily, and the rest of you are miserable sods, and it's going to take me ages to make you happy, then maybe I'll concentrate on him. Okay, what other ambiguities are there?
You might not be able to tell what is the greatest happiness in both cases, or either case.
Okay, that's really an epistemological problem rather than a problem of interpretation, isn't it? But we might say, what is happiness? And different accounts of what happiness is will generate different sorts of utilitarianism, won't they? So if happiness is to have your desires satisfied, that's one form of utilitarianism. If happiness is Aristotelian eudaimonia, that's a different sort of utilitarianism. Any other ambiguities there? What about in the greatest number? We looked at whether Hitler might have been a good utilitarian. It's just that he didn't count Jews. So if we want to say, well, the greatest number of what? Humans? Animals, including human animals? Sentient beings, etc., etc. It starts to become quite difficult. Mill meant humans, but Bentham thought it was all animals.
To him, any sort of changes in the meaning of who it is they're talking about.
Okay, and then we reflected on whether there are different qualities of happiness. Do you remember Mill thinks there are different qualities, and that in making the utilitarian calculus we've got to count the different qualities of happiness as well as the different quantities, whereas Bentham thought it was just quantities, not qualities. Okay, and what did we look at when we looked at there? We looked at a particular charge against Mill, which was that he might be an elitist, yes. What does he mean by quality of happiness? Is he suggesting that superior forms of happiness are things like going to philosophy lectures and inferior forms of happiness are going to things like bingo? If he does mean that, then it looks as if it's very difficult for him to avoid the charge of elitism. Well, that's a different question that we'll put on one side for a minute. And I suggested that another way to understand it might be to think of the difference between a superior form of happiness being the sort of happiness that a rational animal can achieve by forming a goal for themselves, setting out a strategy by which to achieve that goal, and then achieving it. And that, as we all know, brings a happiness that, you know, can we compare it to the happiness we get from eating a good meal or drinking a good glass of wine? Maybe that's what he meant by superior forms of happiness, with the inferior being the sort of things that just come from satisfying bodily needs or desires.
Actually, I found that a bit difficult the more I thought about it, because I thought, would I prefer a good meal, you know, with a bit of wine, rather than, you know, I don't know, reading a book by Hume or something. And actually, I had to say, I'm fully sorry, but I had to say I prefer the meal.
Right, okay, fair enough. And it's certainly the case that all of us are going to sometimes prefer the good meal, aren't we? We can't always be doing philosophy lectures, either listening to them or giving them, indeed. So, yes, there's... Mill claims that there are different qualities of happiness and these need to be brought into account, but you might prefer to go with Bentham, thinking that actually even if there are different qualities of happiness, the qualities don't count, it's only the quantities. So poetry might be better than pushpin, but that's only because poetry is likely to make many more people happy or make for much more happiness than a single game of pushpin. Okay, then finally we reflected on the distinction between act and rule utilitarian, where act utilitarian is...
Token?
Sorry?
Act is a token action, isn't it?
That's right, yes. So you're looking at the token act in order to see whether it produces the greatest happiness or the greatest number, as opposed to looking at the whether a type of action produces the greatest happiness or the greatest number. And if you look at that, it generates a rule, and then you look at the token action against the rule. That would be rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism is a one-step procedure where you check every action against the greatest happiness or the greatest number. Rule utilitarian is a two-step procedure where you check types of action against the greatest happiness, but then you look at the token action in accordance with that rule. And what is, well, we looked at the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. Why would anyone think that rule utilitarianism is preferable to act utilitarianism? Why would anyone think rule utilitarianism is preferable to act utilitarianism?
Because it gives you a basis to decide without having to calculate the final consequences.
You might think it's easier because we only have to look at an act and think, is it a lie? And if it's a lie, then we shouldn't do it, presuming that one of our rules is, yes, that's true, it could be easier. Another reason is that it's intuitively acceptable to us in a way because it fits in with the idea that there are moral rules. We all think that, roughly speaking, we shouldn't lie, shouldn't kill, should keep promises, etc. And rule utilitarianism generates those very rules. So it's quite intuitively acceptable to us. Okay, so that's what we did last week. And we've now finished our romp through the different moral theories that we're going to look at, all 4 of them. And this week we're going to compare and contrast them, and you're going to decide which you like best. We're going to do a poll at the end, not that the poll necessarily has any basis in which is the right theory, of course. It might be just which one do you like best, or which one have I taught best, or all sorts of things. But we'll have a look at which one comes out top in this class. Okay, so let's have a quick run through all of them, just to refresh our memory about what they all are. So Aristotle, and we're looking at his virtue theory, or rather the theory he initiated, because modern day virtue theories are often not terribly Aristotelian, but he got them all started. And basically Aristotle argues that the right action is that which is performed by a virtuous person. And do you remember when I said that to you, you all went, huh? You know, that's not very helpful. Okay, but we have to know what a virtuous person is. And for Aristotle, a virtuous person is a person who knows what is right, does what is right, and then does what is right for the right reason. Do you remember that? So we looked at the moral dilemma that I brought up in the first week, the one that says, what happens when your mum comes home and says, you know, do you like my hair? And you think, yuck. And you can't be both kind and honest, so you've got a bit of a problem here. And so the rules that you've been given as children are not going to help you here. You've got to engage in what Aristotle calls right reason. And what Aristotle says is that if you're a virtuous person, you know what you should do in this situation. Now, notice that you're in a particular situation now, with all the particularities of that situation. So, for example, if I say your mum's been depressed for 6 months, and this is the first time you've seen her smile, okay, does that push you towards being kind rather than being honest? Or another thing, if your mum has a bit of a habit of coming back with the most terrible hairstyles, and then 3 weeks later thinks, you know, oh my God, you know, how could you have let me go out like that? Which does that push you towards? Okay, so do you see, the more you know about the context, the easier it is perhaps to make the moral decision. But the fact is, if you're a person who has encouraged yourself in the habits of virtue, to be courageous, to be honest, to be kind, all those things, then you will know in that situation what it is to do the right thing. If you don't know, what should you do? Ask someone you do believe to be a virtuous person. That's right. You ask for advice from someone you think of as virtuous. Okay, but let's say you know in that situation. You've then got to do it. And we all know that actually knowing what the right thing is to do, or believing what the right thing is to do, does not mean necessarily that you're going to do it. We can all be weak. We can all be, well, we can, can't we? So, but if you're a virtuous person, you're not going to be weak. You're going to not only know what the right action is, you're going to perform it. And finally, you're going to perform it for the right reason. And this draws an interesting distinction between what the right action is and the morality of the action itself and the morality of the agent performing the action. Because you can perform an action that is the one required by morality, but without actually being moral yourself in doing it. So let's say that the right action in this situation is being honest. Okay? So you know that being honest is the right thing to do, and you what's more, you are honest. But you're honest because you're feeling a bit spiteful. Do you see?
Yes.
At the moment you tell your mum her hair looks horrible, you're not doing it because you want to save her from looking horrible, da-da-da-da. You're doing it because you feel a bit mean at that moment. We've all had that sort of feeling, haven't we? And the other possibility is that you can be kind, not because you think that being kind is the right thing to do, but because you lack moral courage.
Oh, yes,
You believe that you should tell the truth, but you quail at the last minute. Okay, so in each of those cases you might be doing the right thing, but you're not doing it for the right reason. And Aristotle would say you're not, for that very reason, being a virtuous person at that moment, and probably not a virtuous person full stop, because you haven't got yourself into the right habits. Okay, so that's Aristotle. Now, would anyone like to ask questions about Aristotle before we go on to Hume, or shall I go through them all, and then we'll go through them all? Put your hand up if you think I should go through them all. Okay, you're just making me work, that's what it is. Okay, that's Aristotle. This is Hume. Hume argued that the right action is that for which a true judge, okay, one who adopts a stable and general